In the quaint community of Ocean, nestled in the heart of Edo State, a sense of camaraderie and brotherhood pervaded the air. This harmonious atmosphere was further underscored by the presence of the esteemed Edo State Polytechnic Ocean, a beacon of knowledge and learning that drew young minds from far and wide. It was within this tranquil setting that a peculiar phenomenon had long been observed: confraternity wars, which often plagued other regions, rarely escalated into fatal conflicts in Ocean. Instead, these disputes typically remained confined to intense fistfights, with nary a reported death to speak of. This unusual dynamic, however, was not immune to the whims of fate. A significant development took place sometime last year, marking a seismic shift in the delicate balance of power within the confraternity landscape. A regime change swept through two prominent confraternities, namely the BL00DIEST confraternity and the Jurist confraternity. In an astonishing twist, two brothers emerged as the leaders of these respective organizations. This unexpected turn of events would have far-reaching consequences, testing the bonds of brotherhood and loyalty that had long defined the relationship between these two siblings. The brothers in question had grown up under the same roof, sharing a childhood marked by laughter, tears, and countless moments of shared experience. They had eaten from the same pot, relying on each other for support and comfort as they navigated the trials and tribulations of youth. As fate would have it, the leader of the Jurist confraternity was, in fact, the uncle of the BL00DIEST leader, with a 4-year age gap separating the two. Despite this familial bond, the brothers had grown into distinct individuals, each with their own unique personality, strengths, and weaknesses. Their relationship, however, remained incredibly close-knit. A testament to this bond was the story of the Jurist leader's imprisonment, during which his younger brother, the future BL00DIEST leader, had rallied alongside others to raise the funds necessary for his release. This act of selflessness and loyalty had further solidified the ties between the two brothers, forging a connection that would be tested in the days to come. As the leaders of their respective confraternities, they would be forced to navigate the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and power struggles that define the confraternity landscape. The fate of their relationship, and the future of Ocean's fragile peace, hung precariously in the balance. The confraternity war between the BL00DIEST and the Jurist had its genesis in a seemingly innocuous altercation between a young man affiliated with the BL00DIEST and some junior jurists, collectively known as the Sons of Jurist. This young man, a student of Edo State Polytechnic Ocean, had found himself at odds with the junior jurist, and the situation had rapidly escalated into physical violence. The junior jurist, fueled by a sense of bravado and a desire to assert their dominance, had brutally beaten the young BL00DIEST member, leaving him battered and bruised. To add insult to injury, they had also relieved him of his phone and wallet, a brazen act of thievery that would ultimately prove to be a catalyst for the conflict that was to come. The beaten BL00DIEST member, still reeling from the trauma of the assault, had stumbled home and recounted his ordeal to his fellow BL00DIEST. The news of the attack had spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of anger and outrage within the BL00DIEST ranks. The BL00DIEST, determined to avenge their brother's honor and seek justice for the wrongs perpetrated against him, had mobilized their forces and set out to track down the junior jurist responsible for the attack. However, their quest for vengeance was initially thwarted, as the junior jurist had wisely gone into hiding, sensing the wrath that was to come. In an attempt to defuse the tense situation, the senior jurist had intervened, seeking to mediate a peaceful resolution to the conflict. They had managed to retrieve the wallet that had been stolen from the BL00DIEST member, a gesture that was meant to be a conciliatory overture. However, their inability to recover the phone had proved to be a sticking point, a source of ongoing tension that would ultimately contribute to the escalation of the conflict. The conflict had officially commenced when the BL00DIEST, still seething with anger and resentment, had beaten up a senior jurist member. The jurist, not once to back down from a fight, had retaliated in kind, beating up an BL00DIEST member in a tit-for-tat exchange of violence. This cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation had continued unabated, with both sides trading blows and neither gaining the upper hand. It was a conflict that would ebb and flow, marked by periods of relative calm punctuated by outbreaks of violence. The confraternity wars in Ocean had traditionally been characterized by a certain code of honor, a set of unwritten rules that governed the behavior of the various factions involved. Fistfights and other forms of physical violence were commonplace, but fatalities were extremely rare. However, the conflict between the Air Lords and the Jurists would ultimately prove to be an exception to this rule. The war had taken a deadly turn when the hit squads of both confraternities had clashed at a predetermined location. In the ensuing melee, a senior jurist member, who was also a known wheat seller, had been killed instantly. This senseless tragedy had marked the first reported death in a court-related fracas in the history of Ocean, sending shockwaves of fear and uncertainty throughout the community. The aftermath of the killing had been marked by an uneasy calm, a sense of anticipation that had hung in the air like a challenge. However, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, it seemed as though the matter had been allowed to die a natural death. There had been no reported reprisals, no retaliatory attacks or acts of vengeance. It was as though both sides had collectively decided to bury the hatchet, to put the past behind them and move forward in a spirit of peace and reconciliation. However, this fragile peace had been shattered by the Air Lords' decision to release a song that bragged about their role in the killing of the senior jurist member. This crass and insensitive act had been seen as a deliberate provocation, a calculated attempt to rub salt in the wounds of their adversaries. The song had not been well received by the jurists, who had taken umbrage at the Air Lords' brazen display of arrogance and disrespect. The stage was now set for a renewed cycle of violence and retaliation, as the conflict between the Air Lords and the jurists threatened to escalate into unprecedented heights of brutality and bloodshed. The jurist members, still seething with anger and resentment over the Air Lords' provocative song, had decided to take matters into their own hands. They had convened an emergency meeting, during which they had vowed to carry out a retaliatory attack against their sworn enemies. This decision had been fueled by a desire for revenge, a need to avenge the perceived slight and restore their wounded pride. Their target was Ahmed, a high-ranking member of the Air Lords confraternity who had recently been appointed to a prestigious office within the organization. Ahmed was a military officer, a man who commanded respect and inspired awe. However, his newfound position within the Air Lords had made him a marked man, a symbol of the organization's power and influence. Ironically, Ahmed had not been directly involved in the confraternity war that had led to the killing of the jurist member. He had been absent from the scene, carrying out his military duties in a distant location. His absence had not, however, spared him from the wrath of the jurists, who had deemed him guilty by association. The jurist had tracked Ahmed to his home, following him from the football field where he had gone to unwind and relax. They had watched him, studied his movements, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment had arrived when Ahmed had returned to his house, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. The jurists had descended upon Ahmed's residence, their faces twisted with anger and hatred. They had attacked him with ruthless efficiency, leaving him for dead in his own home. The brutal assassination of Ahmed had sent shockwaves through the community, a stark reminder of the escalating violence and bloodshed that had come to define the conflict between the Air Lords and the jurists. Ahmed's killing had been a senseless act of violence, a tragedy that had befallen an innocent man who had been caught in the crossfire of a conflict that was not of his making. His death had served as a grim reminder of the devastating consequences of blind hatred and revenge, a warning that the cycle of violence and retaliation would only lead to more bloodshed and sorrow. The assassination of Ahmed had marked a turning point in the confraternity war, sparking a chain reaction of violence and retaliation that would prove difficult to contain. The Air Lords, still reeling from the loss of their brother, had been consumed by a desire for vengeance. They had regrouped and reassessed their strategy, determined to strike back at their enemies with equal force and ferocity. Their target had been Folaran Shaw, a prominent member of the Jurist confraternity. He had been a well-known figure in the community, a charismatic individual who had earned the respect and admiration of his peers. However, his affiliation with the Jurist had made him a marked man, a symbol of the organization's power and influence. The Air Lords had tracked Folaran Shaw to a public location, where they had lain in wait for the perfect moment to strike. That moment had arrived in broad daylight, when Folaran Shaw had been assassinated in cold blood. The killing had been a brazen act of violence, a deliberate attempt to intimidate and terrorize the jurists and their supporters. Despite the familiar bond between the leaders of the two confraternities, the conflict had continued to escalate, fueled by a cycle of violence and retaliation. The brothers, who had once shared a deep and abiding bond, had found themselves on opposite sides of a deadly conflict, each determined to emerge victorious and assert their dominance. The confraternity war had laid bare the harsh realities of cultism, exposing the myths and misconceptions that had long surrounded this phenomenon. It had shown that no confraternity was entirely peaceful, that even the most seemingly innocuous organizations could harbor violent tendencies and a capacity for bloodshed. The killings had also highlighted the dangers of romanticizing cultism, or viewing certain organizations as inherently more peaceful or benign than others. The reality was that cultism was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, driven by a variety of factors and motivations. It was a problem that required a nuanced and comprehensive approach, one that took into account the social, economic, and cultural context in which it occurred. As the confraternity war continued to rage, claiming lives and destroying families, it was clear that a collective response was needed. It was time for the community to come together and say no to cultism, to reject the violence and bloodshed that had become synonymous with this phenomenon. It was time to seek alternative solutions, to explore new ways of addressing the underlying issues that drove young people to join cults in the first place. Only through a concerted effort could the cycle of violence be broken, and a new era of peace and stability be ushered in.